Hello, everyone. Welcome to Talking Logistics, where we have conversations with thought leaders and newsmakers in the supply chain logistics industry. It's a great pleasure to welcome today's program John Lash, who's Group Vice President, Product Strategy at E2Open. And today we're going to talk about crisis, chaos, and the road ahead, the new era in supply chains. So here we are at the beginning of 2025. What developments and trends will shape the year ahead? Well, if we've learned anything from, 2022 is that predicting in January what's going to happen in the weeks and months ahead is really a fool's errand. All we can say for sure is that 2025 will be, unpredictable, risky, and full of exceptions. But that said, there have been some important lessons learned over the past 4 or 5 years that companies can leverage and apply, moving forward to successfully manage their supply chains. So, what are some of those lessons learned, and how can AI and real-time data help companies navigate the road ahead successfully? Well, those are some of the questions we're going to discuss in today's episode, and it's great to have John on the program to share his insights and advice on this topic. So, John, welcome to the program.
Hey, thanks, Adrian. Always wonderful to be here with you. Really
Yeah, well, it's
appreciate
been
it.
a while since you've been on the program, so you look great, and again, 2025. Hard to believe that it's already here. Time just seems to fly, these days, and it's also hard to believe that in just a few weeks it'll be 5 years since the the COVID pandemic not only
Yeah.
disrupted our everyday lives as we knew it, but also supply chains too. So maybe as a way to get the conversation started, I mean, what's been the lasting impact of the COVID pandemic on supply chain management, and how are global supply chains different today compared to the start of 2020, let's say?
Yeah. As you said, time sure flies. In some ways, it feels like we went into lockdown only yesterday. And at the same time, it feels like ages ago, right? So it was a distant world. So it's interesting how it goes in these two different senses. But one thing is for sure, the pandemic left an indelible mark on supply chains and businesses. And in short, if I sum it up, everything got turned upside down, right? And supply chains were pressure tested in a way that they'd never been done before. And it's not just in one area, but all areas at the same time. It's like demand, supply, transportation, and all aspects were kind of pushed to the limits at the same time, and in some cases to the breaking point. And in the spirit of not letting a good crisis go to waste, I think it's important to take the opportunity to reflect on the impact of the pandemic and supply chains and what really happened and where we landed and what we learned. And so I appreciate you having me on for the session and talking logistics. And throughout the discussion, I'll include some data points from our forecasting and inventory benchmark study that monitored supply chain performance before, during, and after the pandemic. So it was in place. It started 14 years ago, and it was in place as all of this stuff unfolded. So I was able to capture it. And just for context for your listeners, the cohort of companies in the study is from the FMCG industry. So think of this as makers of essential items required to keep us fed and healthy as the pandemic hit the world, right? So it's a pretty important, that's an important group for us. And something similar unfolded in every industry too. So it's not just for FMCG. You had a similar kind of thing with slightly different emphasis on the types of shocks, depending on the nature of each of the industries. So with that, as we're getting ready to dive in, to start off with, let's kind of like wind back the clock a few years, Adrian. And so I don't know, what images come to your mind? Is there any that jump out when the pandemic started?
Well, I mean, obviously it was the masking. Obviously, it was the lack of toilet paper. I think that was the big one in our family. We're a family of six, so you could just imagine how much toilet paper we go through.
Exactly. Toilet paper and empty aisles entire aisles empty on retailer shelves, right? Remember the applause for doctors and nurses at 7 p.m. as they're leaving the hospitals and learning new terms like PPE and scrambling to get supply, like you were saying about the masks and quarantines. Like I went through two of those myself. And of course, there was uncertainty and fear, and it was a scary time, right? With a tragic
Yep.
loss of life. But in terms of the supply chain, the pandemic impacted every aspect, including transportation, demand, and supply. And for transportation, think of the shocks. Like remember those images of all the line of vessels off Long Beach that just kind of went on forever into the ocean, and how that snarled all the supply chains and container costs spinning out of control, right? And of course, like, demand shocks as we head into lockdown. We talked about toilet paper, cleaning supplies, packaged foods, and it was almost like whether it was a top mover or some esoteric item in the tail, everything was flying off the shelves, right? As we all rushed to go and build our own personal safety stocks and, in the pantries that we had in our home. And in an attempt to quantify this, as part of the study, we tracked order cuts. So think instances where there's insufficient supply or transportation capacity in order to go meet the demand. And we saw that cuts exploded during the pandemic in terms of frequency, intensity, and duration. And, I guess it's no surprise that cuts related to the demand shocks, those peaked in April 2020 as the onset of the pandemic happened, as we were shifting into lockdown down, and it went 4 times the baseline. So that's a huge jump. But then late in 2021 to early 2022 came supply shocks, where we saw another peak in order cuts, and this one's even bigger. So it went for 5 times the pandemic baseline or the pre-pandemic baseline. And this time, the root cause was supply constraints and the inability to get raw materials. And so when you look back on that, it was a fascinating dual action with both demand and supply shocks hitting at different times, for almost like a 1-2 punch to supply chains, in addition to all the logistics side that we talked about too. So, where did we land? If we're looking back at this, it's a harder world now than it was in the before times. And while cuts eventually stabilized, they settled at a rate that's around 40% higher than a pre-pandemic baseline. And so, long story short, it's a harder world out there, Adrian. And the pandemic made running a business measurably harder. And it's not just during the pandemic, but afterwards. And it took 4 years, so 4 years for these dynamics to go and play out. And these aren't just speed bumps in the road, but they're major disruptions to business. And so, think of this, if you sum it all up to a national GDP level, this is going to be costing in the hundreds of billions or trillions of dollars, right? So it was a really significant thing.
Yeah, no, I think, all those things, it's great that, looking at that data, to kind of actually see it, in terms of the impact on the supply chains. I mean, I remember, you know, leading up to 2020, and for years beforehand, there was so much talk about becoming more demand driven, right? So it was about having good visibility to demand and being able to really orient your supply chain around what was happening on the demand side of things. And then when you talked about 2020 and and the impact of the pandemic, because there was such shortages of supply, whether they were finished goods or input materials to manufacturing, a lot of companies, and we wrote about this on Talking Logistics at the time, a lot of companies became supply driven, right? So it was about, what do we actually have either raw materials for or finished goods for? And those are the things that we're going to promote. Those are the things that we're actually going to sell versus, things that we may not have finished goods for, things that we may not be able to manufacture just because we can't, procure the materials. So we really saw the swing from being demand driven to being more supply driven for a time because, really, your supply chains really had to be oriented about what you could actually sell and produce, at the time. So I think that was another, shift there that happened during the pandemic. And I think underlying all of that was, and this leads to my next question in terms of, what flaws did the pandemic expose in supply chains? I mean, from my perspective, a lot of companies realized that they had poor visibility to, particularly the supply side of things, right? They really didn't know where the constraints were on the supply side. So, I mean, what's your take in terms of what the flaws were that the pandemic exposed, and what lessons should companies have learned over the past 4 or 5 years to better prepare for future disruptions?
So maybe, Adrian, the question should be, what flaws didn't the pandemic expose in supply chains, right? Because, as I mentioned earlier, everything was under pressure at the same time, and many of the systems broke. And so, like, I guess the number one takeaway for me from the pandemic is that what's been good enough for decades is no longer good enough. And we were talking about the different volatilities, right? And so let's start with demand volatility. And for context, when you think about traditional demand forecasting, it's based on the premise that history repeats itself, right? More hot dogs in summer, more sweaters in the fall, right? And in the past, this was good enough, right? But when the world turns upside down, what actually happened last year, let alone 3 years ago, becomes essentially irrelevant. And this really exposes a major weakness in traditional demand planning methods during a major transit disruption. And no surprise, demand volatility, it spiked during the pandemic, right? So it went off the roof, especially as we went into the lockdown. But one of the things that is even perhaps more important is the volume of business that's exposed to extreme error. And it turns out that extreme error was what I think is really the defining signature of the pandemic. And it really spun out of control. Now, you might say, well, what is extreme error? Well, of course, all supply chains are designed for a certain amount of error. However, not all errors created equal. Extreme error is where your forecasts exceed or fall short of shipments 2 times or more. So this is where you get it way off, not just a little bit off, because supply chains can deal with it, but when you get it way off, and this is the most costly and disruptive to supply chains. So you might say, well, what happened to extreme error during the pandemic? Well, it was a wild ride, and the pandemic pushed it to new levels. And no surprise, the extreme error peaked in 2020 with the panic buying. And at the April 2020 peak, nearly half of all volume was exposed to extreme error. So think, this is half of all of your shipments was exposed to this extreme error, which is the most costly and disruptive to your supply chains and to your business. And equally important is it took 4 years to go and recover back to the baseline levels, which it has now. So was extremely costly. And here's like one more insight that might be interesting is this one's on portfolio management, which is it seems a little bit on the left field, but it really comes back to this main theme. Is that ever since we started this survey 14 years ago, we've gone and looked at item velocity and just how fast your items are moving and how long the long tail is. And you might say to me, well, just how long is that long tail, right? Well, last year is 85% of items. So it kind of follows the Pareto principle. And long tails have been tolerated for years as, well, that's just the way it is, right? It's another example of, well, it's good enough. It's okay to have a long tail. But having a long tail became especially problematic during the pandemic. Why? Because the rise of forecast error for the items in the tail is asymmetrically higher than for the rest of the portfolio. And it jumped more than 20 percentage points, right? That's not relative, but 20 percentage points. So that was a huge hit in error. And the disproportionately higher error in these items mean more service issues, more profit erosion, and more lost opportunities. And this is all at a time when all these metrics were seriously stressed. So just like you were saying, how do we sell what we have? Having all of this extreme error and having or error in the tail really made that a lot harder. And not surprisingly, extreme error for items in the tail was asymmetrically affected too, right? And so remember, this is the most costly and disruptive error to your business. So this kind of makes it a double whammy for companies that have a long tail. So why is it important to go and look back and understand all of the things that happened during the pandemic? It's because I see the pandemic as a wake-up call. And we have the opportunity to be better prepared for the next major disruption because one's going to be coming.
Yeah, no, for sure. It always makes sense to really understand, where we went wrong, right? And what we can do better, moving forward. I mean, as you were talking there in terms of that demand and supply volatility, I mean, it was another classic example to the extreme case of the bullwhip effect, right? And it sounds like based on the data you said, it's taken years to kind of recover from that, extreme there in terms of all of this, I mean, a lot of these orders were kind of pushed in because of this rapid demand for companies and consumers, overbuying, if you will, in the short term,
Yep.
and then drawing in demand, basically moving demand forward, and then being slower, the back end of that. So the bullwhip effect, was something on steroids during this time, and it's taken years for us to recover from that. And I think, talking about the extreme error around the long tail, I think one of the areas that I saw a lot of companies in response to that is to say, hey, do we really need to have this long tail, right? So they started saying, hey, do we really need to have, 15 different varieties of this SKU, right? And they started, rationalizing their SKU offerings. Um, so I think
Yeah,
in
like
that, yeah, go
for
ahead.
an example, like just to kick in, like if you're going for toilet paper, since we mentioned that at the beginning, do you really care whether you leave with a 6 pack, a 12 pack, or a 24 pack? You don't. You just care that you leave with toilet paper.
Right. So I think a lot of
Anyway,
companies took this opportunity, I think, to say, hey, to really take a close look at all of their, their product portfolio and saying, you know, try to rationalize that a little bit to simplify their supply chain because they realized that they had too much complexity in it. And in this type of environment, with all this error that you talked about, it just became, unmanageable, if you will. So of course we can't have a conversation, today without talking about AI, right? And real-time data. Um, but for good reason, right? Because I think, we've seen a lot of innovation over the past 4 or 5 years in this area, and we're beginning to see some of the fruits of that innovation. So, how can AI and real-time data, help, moving forward? Especially when it comes to managing this volatility you were talking about and maximizing, planning investments during disruptions.
so indeed, that is the million-dollar question. And as you said, you can't have a discussion without AI coming up. But the question here is really, can AI and real-time data help businesses better manage volatility and help maximize your planning investments during disruptions? And for context, it's interesting to note that at the start of the pandemic, some folks voiced a concern that AI can only be helpful if it's kind of like quote unquote seen something before, right? And since we've never seen anything like COVID-19 pandemic before, it would be better to turn AI off. And in fact, some vendors recommended that clients do this. And we even had a few clients that decided to proactively turn off AI following this kind of logic trail. And so question here is, was that the right call? And let's look into a few of the metrics, starting with forecast volatility to see how things played out. And it's no surprise that forecast error took a hit during the pandemic, right? So it's spiking up at the onset and staying way well above the baseline for the next 4 years. And this is to be expected given the reliance of traditional forecasting on history repeating itself, like we talked before. But did the use of AI and real-time data to kind of sense changes in demand help? So instead of looking back at historical, but to say what is currently there and how does that help? And the answer is yes. And by sensing demand, what I mean is by using real-time signals from within your operations, so think orders or shipments, along with downstream information such as point of sale, store inventory, warehouse withdrawals, to create forecasts of what your customers are more likely to buy, not just what you hope they'll buy. And it was effective, right? The result was better forecast accuracy at every stage of the pandemic, including during the panic buying and all the supply constraint periods. Now, granted, sensing demand still got it wrong, but a lot less wrong, and it reduced forecast error by around 35%. The other metric you mentioned was value realized from planning investments, right? And how did that pan out? Well, for context, every year companies spend, millions of dollars on people, processes, and technology for planning. And there's the way to go and measure the value of this is called forecast value added. And it's a measure of the return on these investments. And it compares essentially what your final forecast is to something called a naive forecast, which you could basically expect with no investments in people planning or people process or technology. So what was the effect of AI and real-time data on forecast value added? Well, it tripled the value from planning investments across every stage of the pandemic. So this was during the panic buying through the supply shortages across every different stage down to this new normal that we find ourselves in. And so the takeaway here is that when the world gets turned upside down, systematically using real-time data, it's a game changer. Now, we talked about extreme error, so you might say, well, what about extreme error? And remember, extreme error is the defining signature of the pandemic, and it's the most costly and disruptive error to businesses. Well, I guess it should be no surprise that the use of AI and real-time data crushed extreme error, cutting it by more than 60%. So going back to that question at the start, should we turn off or on or leave AI on in the face of a major disruption like the pandemic? Well, the data shows that AI and real-time data are essential to managing risks during major disruptions, even those at pandemic scale. So to the answer, keep it on. But of course, AI, it needs to be rock solid and field hardened, right? The pandemic is no time to be out there on training wheels. And we've got lots of charts and data on this in the study, which is available for download on the E2Open website. And I encourage everyone listening to download the study if they haven't already. It's a really fascinating read.
Yeah, no, for sure. And we'll include the link in our write-up of this episode so that way people can quickly access it. And I think you're right. I remember those conversations in terms of maybe we should turn the AI off because I mean, if what can it learn from the past? Because this is all new and but the key thing here is yes, maybe the past was less relevant in this situation than before. But if you really have the real-time data, the elements of the AI that can leverage that real-time data and information will provide, value. And again, that goes back to, what I mentioned earlier, one of the lessons learned. A lot of companies realize that there's always been a problem, right? That they have black holes in their supply chain. But I think they realize how many black holes they actually do have, right? So they have poor visibility upstream with their suppliers. They may have good visibility to their tier one suppliers, but very poor visibility to tier two, tier three, and beyond, right? They may have good point of sale data, but maybe not for not for all their customers, obviously. Maybe only for the larger ones and not some of their smaller customers. Um, or maybe that information is being sent in a batch environment or so on and so forth. So a lot of data issues I think it exposed a lot of connectivity issues, and I think this is always for me. I always bring it back to the network. Obviously, E2Open, is a big participant. One of the providers of networks, and I think this is really where, to me, I think one of the big positives of the pandemic is that more companies, manufacturers, retailers, distributors, logistics service providers became more aware of the value of being part of connected networks for everything we just talked about today, right? For better sharing of data and information across all the relevant participants, better collaboration between all the participants. I mean, have you seen that as well too in terms of knowledge or interest in leveraging a network platform? Not only, I mean, I tend to focus a lot on the power of the network from a logistics standpoint, but there's a lot of benefits and value in terms of the power of the network from a supply chain planning perspective and collaborative planning and forecasting and all that as well. Um, any insights on that from your
Yeah,
perspective?
yeah, totally. Because all of that information, you got to think of using AI and real-time information. Well, where does that real-time information come from? Some of it comes from within your operations, but most of it comes from, upstream and downstream partners, right? And that's where a lot of the risk lies. And so it's really important to be able to get that information to be able to make better decisions. And then once you've made that decision, to be able to go and orchestrate all these actions across all these different parties. Because, just like you pointed out earlier, if you don't have if you have constraints on certain supply materials, well, why are you running a promotion or why are you trying to do something on something that you can't produce effectively? So look and understand where things, what your supply looks like so that you can shape that demand and vice versa, right? So it's really making sure you have those things connected and it's being part of that network and having resiliency, right? Which is a word that came up a lot right after the pandemic was resiliency and being able to look at that. And essentially, this is what it's all about, is being able to get a better sense of what's happening upstream, downstream, and use that information and better tools there to make better decisions.
Yep. Well, I mean, John, we could probably speak for another hour on all these topics, but maybe as a way to kind of wrap up and summarize, I mean, what defines this new era of supply chains and what action should, companies take in 2025 if they haven't already to, succeed in this new era?
So, I think the new era of supply chains is one of increased uncertainty, both in terms of frequency and intensity, right? So think of the extreme era that we discussed. But, long story short, supply chains have become more inherently more difficult to run than in the past. And the lesson that the pandemic drives home is that what's been good enough in the past is no longer good enough. And for decades, we've designed structural weaknesses and essentially fragility into our supply chains in the pursuit of efficiencies and cost reduction. And the pandemic will put pressure on all of these weaknesses all at once and push systems to the breaking points. And well, things have recovered somewhat. It's harder to run your business today than it has been in the past, about 40% harder. And it took 4 years to settle down into this new baseline. So that's kind of like the big observation from the pandemic, and it defines the new era of supply chains. So what can companies do? Well, don't sit at the sidelines, right? Now is the time to lean in. And here are two different ways. First, if you're already using AI real-time data, then do more. If you're not using it yet, start, right? Because when the world gets turned upside down, the most important thing is to make decisions based on what's actually happening right now, not what happened in the past. And I shared a number of different examples from the study related to forecasting, but it's not just planning, it's execution too. Think of transportation lead times, right? And their variability. During the pandemic, we saw how a 13-day lead time for materials could more than double, right? And then transportation lead times, well, they were all over the place. Remember all those ships off Long Beach, right? And now, say tariffs get imposed on everything that comes into the country, right? What would that do to uncertainty? Or maybe escalating tensions in Ukraine or the Middle East. Maybe those go and widen into a larger war. Or this new, I don't know if you heard about this recently, Adrian, this HMPV virus outbreak, which we're hearing about in China. What if that goes pandemic and is something that's more serious, right? If any of these things happen, wouldn't it be nice to make decisions based on what's actually going on in your supply chain and your value chain right now instead of what just used to happen a few years ago? Um, and second, as you were mentioning, get more connected in your planning and your execution. Think beyond the four walls of your organization to your upstream and downstream partners that make up your value chain. Because as we said earlier, this is where the majority of your risks lie. For example, think semiconductor supply shortages impacting automotive production and shut down the F-150 lines, right? That's never ever happened before, right? Or demand shocks during panic buying just before the lockdowns. And, then the big questions are not just how and when it will recover, but what will this new normal look like? Because what we learned from the pandemic is that when things do recover, it doesn't go back to business as usual. The profiles change. And, I think overall here, it's important to recognize that it's not academic. Getting this right provides a big competitive advantage. And at extreme could be the difference between staying in business or not. So I would say like the two takeaways here are use AI and real-time data and get connected. But whatever you do, make sure to take action now and to better manage the harder world that we find ourselves in this post-pandemic environment and to get ahead of the next major disruption because we know it's coming. And it might make the pandemic, the C-19 that we had, look like child's play. So get ahead, take action now. That's the one thing that I'd say.
Yeah, no, great, great advice. And going back to something you've said a couple of times, the processes that worked in the past, and the technologies and so forth that worked in the past are not going to be the right ones, moving forward. Makes me think of that famous Marshall Goldsmith quote, what got you here won't get you there. And I think that's very true, today. So. Definitely a time not to be on the sidelines, time to really start taking action, whether it's getting started or moving beyond what you've already have done until now. John, again, Again, great insights, great advice, and thank you for making the time to be with us today.
Oh, well, thanks so much for having me on. Always a pleasure, Adrian.
Great. I want to thank those of you that joined us today. Again, like I said, I will post the link to the report that John was referencing in the write-up to this so that you can download that report. But again, thank you for joining us. If you got a question or a comment for John, you can post it either here on Talking Logistics or on the E2Open website, and I'm sure he'll be more than happy to respond via that medium. Again, thank you for joining us and look forward to seeing you in a future episode of Talking Logistics. Have a great day.
Thanks, Sam.